Only when you're ready. Have you all filled up the ballots?
Wow, it's only a CG prep time.
Then you go and fill out the ballot for us. Complain too much.
你可以看回忆吗？我不知道。可以你在讲什么？看什么？Hello people.
Do I need to press on any button or that's fine?
Was that all recorded?
Yeah, it's.
Oh shit.
You still don't pretend that anybody's actually watching this right now.
Watching you maybe.
Sorry, semua watching.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Almost watch. Okay.
Two people came up to me after our previous one and said, really?
Yeah, I know one person who religiously watches live stream, Anish Verde. Yeah.
I can actually watch
Thank you.
Come on from 5, Kuala Lumpur, Chan 217. Yay. On the motion that this House believes that ASEAN should abandon its principle of non-interference in its member states' political affairs, we call upon Prime Minister. Here.
The biggest criticism of ASEAN is that during the Asian financial crisis, when Singapore and Philippines were clearly in the know that the problem of the Thai baht will eventually lead to the collapse of economies, they did nothing. Absolutely nothing. And as a result of that, the entire institution was weakened as a whole. Firstly, what does non-interference look like? Non-interference in the past probably means that you censor your own media. Like for example, you refrain from making political statements of the state of affairs of your fellow ASEAN countries. For example, that you do not go to have a unifying code of human rights agenda in these kind of situations. For example, you do not send over political experts to the other country because you fear that if you are going to advise on the economic failings or economic progress of this particular country, is going to lead to the sensitive response from the public. And obviously, the reverse is true. Interference probably means that we are going to interfere in every domain, whether it's politics, environment, or economics in these kind of instances. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to first begin by saying that ASEAN has evolved. That in the past, it was true that the existential threat that it's facing was in between states. Like for example, the Cambodia-Vietnam wars. That's why interstate sensitivity is of an important concern. But now we are talking about an external threat. What is this external threat? It's probably for example, the withdrawal of the US, the promised pivot that never came. But more importantly, it's also the increasing aggressiveness of China when it comes to, for example, the South China Sea issue, or even in the economic dimension, whereby they threaten to use the One Belt, One Road policy as the maritime routes that once sailed through Southeast Asia. This is an important consideration. So given that there is a change in the nature of threats that it has faced, ASEAN has broken its record of non-interference on several occasions. For example, in the political sphere, during the confrontation between Sabah and between Malaysia and Philippines over the issue of Sabah, it was Indonesia that took on an active role as a mediator to try and resolve this conflict before it spills over. I'm going to give a few principal reasons why this policy is necessary. The first reason is because human rights is important. Let us first understand that we are no longer talking about third world countries 20 or 30 years ago. We have given enough time for economic development in these kind of countries. it is also important that the stifling of democracy or democratic processes in these countries need to come to an end. I'm not saying an immediate end, but at least a gradual end. And that must begin, for example, a criticism of the overt human rights abuses, like for example, there's happening right now in Myanmar. But secondly, the second principal reason is because of the principle of proximity, that you are in close proximity within each other. You share rather similar political systems. You have similar struggles. That means that when it comes to understanding the nuances of the ground, that you probably understand them the best. But keeping this knowledge to yourself and not doing anything about it is extremely selfish, and you no longer break the trust within this special relationship. But more importantly is the effect of the contagion. And this is important, whether or not it's about the economic contagion that took place during the Asian financial crisis, or, for example, like the spillover effects of race and religion and ethnic violence across the borders of Myanmar. All these things have a direct impact on your economy as well as the overall makeup of society. On top of that, we also talk about how, for example, investors' confidence within the Southeast Asian region is directly affected when one particular country is, like for example, embroiled in controversy. That happened during Myanmar during the overthrow. The retreat of the junta. On the environmental front, whatever that you do, whatever Indonesia do, when it comes to the hazing policy, raising and hazing policy, has a direct impact on these countries surrounding it. And member states themselves have every interest. They owe a duty to their own individual citizens to protect the citizens from this contagion effect. And that is why it needs to act on to break non-interference silence in this kind of situation. No, thank you. So the important question is then, why will it work? For it to work, these countries must still continue to stay within the framework, because I'm quite sure OO will come up here and say that no, that it will disintegrate, countries will just go their separate ways. A few reasons why they will stay together. Firstly, because they need to stay together so that they have a collective bargaining power. This is particularly important. For example, in the economic sphere, we talk about how the TPP no longer makes a lot of relevance when the United States has pulled out of that particular picture. Imagine if within the ASEAN community there is further disintegration in this kind of situation. The impact of the trade relationship between those countries and the collective benefit that results of it will even become more marginalized. But secondly, I'm willing to argue and bite the bullet that the countries that are most likely to leave ASEAN are the countries that will not leave ASEAN for the simple reason, like for example, Myanmar, Vietnam, for the simple reason that their economic ties with the rest of ASEAN is the strongest. Prior, like for example, to opening of Myanmar to the international sphere, for the longest time, Singapore, Malaysia were the top two investors within Myanmar region. But thirdly, because China is using a divide and rule strategy, and ASEAN recognizes that. They recognize that when China goes to have direct bilateral relationship, like Xi Jinping makes multiple trips to these different countries, all through these phone calls, there is a strategy to divide them so that they can exploit them in terms of bilateral relationship. This is when it starts to realize that its potential as a region only exists if it stays together as a community. But last but not least, I'm going to extend this debate a little further by talking about the international dimension, about how ASEAN eventually wants to put itself on the map. And this is a very important point. The input of these kind of interference, like for example, when Singapore sends the policy experts over to Malaysia, is that there is going to be a huge impact on the transformational change on Malaysian policies. Because for the longest time, there is a politics of envy. There is constant comparison made between two similar countries. And you're always questioning whether or not government can further improve on the economic processes and cut down on the kinds of corruption that particular exists. But more importantly, because this is the precise time point, many governments are in the state of transition, whether it's in Vietnam or Myanmar. That is the reason why these kind of interference that you have, the comments on the economics and political rights, is going to make a substantial difference. But finally, because in the end, if we want to have a kind of human rights charter that is unique to the taste of the local flavors of ASEAN, we need to collectively decide on something that can be juxtaposed against the rest of the world, whether it's the UNHCR or the European Declaration of Rights in these kind of situations. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to propose.
You think Prime Minister. Next, we invite the Opposition. Yeah.
When the ASEAN was established, it never specified in its mandate that it had to establish political unity and peace within the region, but was established as a result of it recognizing that a precursor to everything in that region is essentially allowing economically underprivileged countries within its area to flourish and therefore maximizing economic opportunities for the entire region. What will I talk about in my speech? Generally, what is the opposition okay with, and what kind of interference we are talking about? Because I don't think opening government is very clear regarding that. Secondly, I'll talk about how human rights violations will be made exponentially worse under their side, and how victims, especially minority communities, will be hurt even more. And lastly, why we think it will actually result in more disunity within those countries and lack of information for you to investigate further harms. So before moving on, generally, what is opposition okay with, and what kind of non-sanctions are we talking about? So there are lots of varied claims and like sweeping statements made by Prime Minister. Number one, obviously the ASEAN, we are not okay with the ASEAN sanctioning, militarizing or taking actions to enter or interfere within the political decision making of its member states. Number one, this doesn't include a lot of financial decisions or microeconomic advisory that the ASEAN is mandated to do. So if I, as a country like Singapore, feel like a financial crisis impending and it literally affects the financial health of my country, I have the ability to say, look, you are screwing up the economy of ASEAN. That's literally their mandate. Secondly, by virtue of this, economic things such as the One Belt, One Road policy that China is propagating falls under the sphere of, we don't think it's a good economic decision for Thailand or for the Philippines to open up its borders for China. Yes, these kind of arguments can be made while steering away from sweeping statements like, no, as a country, you should never establish ties with China. We think those kinds of discussions regarding OBER can still be made under our side. Thirdly, a lot of their examples, such as Indonesia burning forests and therefore compromising the health of our country, can also falls under the mandate of individual countries, because you are hurting members of my own country as opposed to political things that happen under your own side. We think it still falls under the mandate of a country like Malaysia telling Indonesia to stop burning forest fires because it actually hurts the health of my community, as opposed to a sovereign decision that a country made on its own. What ASEAN should not interfere with is dictating what sovereign countries do with regards to their own people, their own political system, and the kinds of political aids they are willing to accept and the relations that they have. Therefore, if they want to be buddies with China, we let them if it affects their own people, but we think we're wary if their economic decision making hurts our own currency, the health of our own people, and our own safety. We think those still fall within the mandate of countries within ASEAN and the ASEAN as a whole. Principally, why do we think ASEAN's mandate was never to ensure political, intrude politically within its member states? It was to ensure that optimum economic cooperation is made, and essentially to ensure that it's a precursor to all other kinds of stability. And the kinds of things that ASEAN countries provide within itself is very unique compared to things that EU or US does. A lot of these things are rice, wheat, corn, a lot of exchanges that happen that determine the survivability of the people within that exchange. The last thing I would like to touch upon on principle that opening government touched on was that, look, by virtue of proximity, therefore you have an obligation to interfere. We don't necessarily think so. By virtue of proximity, then countries within ASEAN are have more of a responsibility to their own people to ensure that ASEAN continues to ensure that ASEAN gets more of an economic pie out of ASEAN. Therefore, they have more of a responsibility to their own people as opposed to interfering in the political happenings of another country. Secondly, why do you think human rights violation will be made worse? It's a bit weird that they didn't really talk about Rohingya and the Myanmar crisis, but we still think obviously it will be part of the political interference. Why do you think it's extremely bad? Because we think human rights violations are made even worse when the economic pie within a country is made smaller. When less of our resources exist, we think the ruling elite oftentimes have an incentive to hoard more, because we assume the kind of sanctions you will do will reduce their resources, will reduce their income, will reduce the cash flow and imports that that country, especially the ruling elite, have. What happens now when people, especially the ruling class, are more desperate? Who's hurt the most? The minority communities that exist within those ASEAN countries, because these are the minority, like the Rohingya or other minority communities, that are going to be deprioritized first. So these are the communities that will get less aid, less compensation packages, less ability to have food on their table, because their country is going to prioritize the majority race as opposed to them. Not only is this hurt in the short run, but it escalates to long run hunger and literal disempowerment of these communities. You think you make human rights violation worse. And secondly, it's not just taking away resources from them, but these are communities that will actively be blamed for the economic deprivation. Because of you, the Rohingya community, we as a country had to suffer and not be able to have access to a lot of the economic resources that we were previously promised. These are the kind of hijacking of narrative that will happen by extremist sanctions of those countries, who will blame these minorities for the fact that ASEAN sanctioned them and took away resources from them. Their lives are at stake, and it can be made comparatively much, much worse. Closing.
Are you then okay with nation states individually sanctioning a foreign state?
We think if, as part of an international UN convention was passed, we are okay with that if they say that. But as a part of an ASEAN, we do not want them to be okay with any sanction, to make any statements. We think that's okay with that. We're fine with status quo. So if the US is doing it, if the EU is doing it, we're good with that. Lastly, why do you think it actually reduces the ability for ASEAN to improve organic change within their country? Look, even if I stay as an ASEAN member, I am fearful that the next target will be me. I am fearful of sharing any information about my next step with ASEAN as a whole, because I will be blamed and therefore they will come after me. You have less of an ability for ASEAN leaders to actually ensure that less human rights violation and more calculated economic decisions are made, because I have generally less access and cooperation with that country. These backdoor negotiations are not going to take place because they view the ASEAN as an entity that is further trying to propagate Western notions of what it means to have a politically stable country, whereas the initial mandate of ASEAN was never to do that. We think essentially, in the process of trying to have a politically unified ASEAN, not only do you reduce economic opportunity for your own people and others, you make human rights violation for the most vulnerable communities even worse.
We thank leader of opposition. Next, we invite the Prime Minister. Yeah.
Hey, what's this? Oh.
There are three things we need to understand about ASEAN before we go on to how this policy will change things. Number one,
ASEAN nations are very young. Most of them only got independence in the late 1940s to the 1960s. This means that there's a huge gap in terms of the knowledge of the running of the political affairs of each country. There are also huge disparities between the political knowledge of each country in running their economy and ensuring political stability. That is why communication and interfering in places where political instability will break out or economic instability will break out is the only way to ensure a transference of knowledge that can prevent outbreaks of disasters for the entire region. I do not think this was meaningfully engaged with. Number two, what is ASEAN afraid of? It is true that at the start of ASEAN in 1967, it was created as an economic community. We think by and large there have been many things like the AFTA in 1992 and the AEC in 1998 that have already fulfilled these things. What ASEAN wants to do in the modern day, this was important from Marvin, is to hedge itself as a political legitimate body in the UN to rival the EU so that it can brand itself with its cultural norms as one that's acceptable to the third world as well. This can only be done when it's seen as a legitimate body that has its act together, that is working together, instead of disparate individual countries that run different policies that do not work together. This is why commenting each other and working together in that way is so important. Lastly, ASEAN is geographically incredibly close to each other. This means that the political affairs of each country intimately affects other nations, right? So just because that a certain boundary says that you are my citizen and you are their citizen, does not mean that the political affairs does not intimately affect the lives of people across the border. And that is incredibly important. There were two key lines of logic that we forwarded. One, you have an obligation to your own citizens to interfere. And second, how interference empowers all ASEAN nations. Let's look at these two things. So first, the obligation. The first thing, that opening tried to do was caveat out comment, right? To say, oh, we can already comment on these kind of things. No, you can't, because it's a culture of goodwill. I will try my best not to comment on your instances because it's a culture of self-censorship. And the problem with that is that I always over self-censor because I'm afraid of pushing their buttons too much and making them really angry and saying that I don't respect ASEAN unity, right? This is not something that I follow the rules by. This is something that is a culture that's generated over the years and it entrenches itself over the years. That's why it gets worse over time. Furthermore, they say that individual countries can already comment on these kind of things, right? If it's only individual countries commenting, like Singapore providing assistance to Indonesia, Indonesia is just likely to ignore it because it's one individual country. That's why ASEAN interfering is important, because it's the way of the entire region to show how important these issues are to them to begin with, right? That's the comparison that we set up very clearly. Lastly, they say that if it hurts us, we can always intervene. So that's the exception we'll create. That's truistic, right? Precisely because of everything we said, every political affair within each country will hurt another country. So by that logic, they've already crossed the house on our side of the house. So what are these relations, right? Number one, racial relations. ASEAN is made of a place with a common mix of heterogeneous countries, right? With a lot of Malays, Chinese, and Indians. And also, ASEAN is built on large immigrant communities. For example, the Moro Mindanos from Philippines are now in Sabah because of migration, and Patani Muslims in Thailand. So this is incredibly important because you can't say that one citizen belongs to another. There are huge immigrant communities throughout ASEAN. This is dangerous, right? For example, Sabah houses Mindanao rebels, right? Or how Kelantan houses Patani rebels from Thailand. They literally threaten the territorial integrity of their fellow ASEAN states. I think they have a right to interfere in these places, right? After the Chinese massacre in Indonesia, after the Asian financial crisis, those Chinese massacres actually spread to Malaysia and the Philippines as well because the Chinese dominated the economy, right? I don't mean a massacre, I mean tensions against races, right? For example, Rohingya Muslims threaten race relations in Indonesia and Malaysia right now because of the oppression that Muslims are facing from Buddhist terrorist organizations, right? These affect your own people and your own political stability. You have a right to intervene. Closing.
With two goals on your side, you want to be more Western and you also want greater, let me finish, implementation of these rights. Does it mean you're going to do things like courts, new laws?
Okay, I get it, sir. Look, this is the fantastic thing, right? I was going to mention later. When ASEAN forwards human rights, we don't have to do it in a Western way. What ASEAN can do is use its own brand of cultural norms of human rights. The important here is that they can only do this when they're respected as a political and legitimate body that has its act together to begin with. Otherwise, the EU and the UN are going to impose their own standard of human rights on these individual nation states, and ASEAN cannot do anything to say, well, let's strike a balance, let's
have some ASEAN cultural norms and human rights at the same time. Furthermore, all the economic analysis that we talked about contagion was not dealt with. And the idea about how individual populations can weigh different economic policies through the expertise that was provided was also not dealt with. Let's further deal with human rights violations a little more, right? They say they'll implement sanctions. That's not the only thing ASEAN can do, right? Like ASEAN always implements common declarations to show its weight and its opinion over these issues, right? It doesn't mean you have to sanction Myanmar. We can always send political advisors to help them transition into democracy, right? We don't have to do it through brute force as well. Furthermore, I'd like to point out that even if we did use sanctions actually did work to force Myanmar to open up and allow Aung San Suu Kyi to run again instead of being put in house arrest. So I'm not sure why that's a bad thing, right? Furthermore, we told you on outside the house, you can actually hatch an ASEAN version of human rights and how this form is incredibly important on our side of the house. So for all of these reasons, we think that outside actually protects human rights in a meaningful way that respects cultural norms on our side of the house. Especially when openly was willing to say that we will accept things like the UN and the EU and the US continuing these sanctions. Now I think the marginal harm is like at best small, right? Because if the entire US is placing sanctions on you, every single harm that they say is going to happen on their side of the house. So they've lost that as well. So the whole issue of international legitimacy was not dealt with. We told you that the context of ASEAN is that they face an existential threat, right? China with the South China Sea, the One Belt One Road policy that threatens the maritime industry of ASEAN, Trump that is refusing to return to the pivot to Asia compared to Obama's administration. In such a context where there is no larger state to buffer the region, the only way for each country within ASEAN to show its strength is to show its strength collectively. And this can only occur when there is a common policy throughout all these nations. If you do not comment on each policy, you're unable to achieve these things. Lastly, on sharing information, right? First of all, many of these countries don't share information within the status quo because of non-interference. A good example of this is how Suharto refused to reveal information of hotspots of the forest fires in 1997 because they saw this as disgrace to the country when Singapore requested for these things. Unless you create a norm where Singapore can demand for these things and interfere, say you're expected to do this for ASEAN unity, then we will never be able to share information meaningfully and force countries to cooperate. We think that ASEAN is very different from 1967. OO was unable to recognize this. In the modern day, ASEAN needs to up its game, and this is the policy we're proud to propose.
Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Just a reminder, we're now using this observer's phone, so I will not be reading any bells. That should ring. It doesn't affect. Okay.
I think it's very funny that the previous speaker comes up and talks about how we think that ASEAN should basically have all the jurisdictions of basically what the EU has right now. Given the fact that the EU is a big flop right now, given the fact that many people are having less faith in the EU, given the fact that people acknowledge that every time you co-opt yourself in a bigger institution, it always comes at the expense of your own people by your need to supposedly have a moral obligation and care for others. I think just establishing an idealistic world of how we should care and why this is great is not enough for you to win this debate. In my speech, I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, why we think this hurts the credibility of ASEAN to maintain any form of influence, and secondly, how we best achieve change. All my rebuttals are integrated. So firstly, why this hurts the credibility of ASEAN to maintain influence. OG, first off, tells us that there really is no fear for us to impose any sort of expected behavior upon ASEAN members, because the reality is they will never leave because they want like a collective bargaining chip, i.e. against China. Several responses to this.
Firstly, I think this presumes the intricacy of a trade deal with China is agreed upon by all members of states, as if they have all same equal forms of interest when it comes to dealing with China. The fact that the Philippines probably have more disagreements in comparison to China, as opposed to, say, for example, Malaysia. Malaysia has less resistance towards like this whole one belt, one road idea or any forms of trade. The fact that we sell land and projects towards rich Chinese corporations, as opposed to the Philippines, who is more caught up with like territorial disputes with China, already presumes that right now this collective bargaining chip in and of itself can't be a benefit if it is difficult for you to materialize it, given the fact that different members have different interests. But the second response is that even if this is true, that the bargaining chip is there, I think that it is like diluted by the fact that like staying in ASEAN causes you to have to be forced to act against your own will. The fact that you have to sanction Thailand, or you have to sanction Myanmar, or you have to sanction the Philippines. The fact that like you have to militarize and give weaponry aid and soldiers towards these causes, independent of the fact that currently you have terrorists within certain parts of your region that are coming at the expense of like your own citizens being victimized. Because whether you like it or not, resources are finite, right? And given the fact, the context that OG gave you, which is that ASEAN is very much made up of like nascent democracies or countries that are struggling economically, all the more reason proves our point. Their resources are even more finite for them as opposed to European countries. The fact that we have a higher rate of poverty, the fact that you have a much more bigger gap within socioeconomic inequality proves that governments need to concentrate on their people before meddling into other businesses. But thirdly, it is unclear to me why it is that OG is taking the typical debate argument for granted that China is bad, we don't want them, as opposed to explaining to us that sometimes there may be some good towards some business corporations and deals with China. So I think this argument is a wash. No. The second thing under this question of why we think this ends up losing out the credibility of ASEAN is that OJ gives us like this weird context, right? They say that non-interference means that you have no information, you don't send out investigators, there's censorship to have discourse about political positions of that governments against like other member states. But suddenly, we should interfere, guys, because we as the neighboring countries know the most, we have the most intricate ideas and information about them, that we are best able to make this judgment call. I think it is unclear as to how they go about into saying they know the most. This is just to point out that at least they don't know what they want. So what do we want, and what is the clearer, more consistent characterization that OO has? In our world, perhaps it's true. Government officials can't make official statements with regards to this like politically sensitive issues, but independent journalists still go in. Private media companies still report. How the hell do you think right now we're reading about it in NST, right? About Rohingyas and all that. The fact that citizens online have access to BBC, CNN, Economist, and then have a discourse about it on social media. All of this is important because it gives awareness to our people to be able to run charity drives and tangibly help victims like Rohingyas, right? In your world, I think that the government, like the Aung San Suu Kyi government, no thank you, is more likely, guys, don't do this. Don't, like, if it's 15 seconds in between, sit down, wait 15 seconds. The Aung San Suu Kyi government will block out any media from coming in and secondly, will control much more the influx of going in and out of Malaysian, Indonesians, or the Filipino citizens. Because every time you allow an individual from a member state to come in, you fear that this person will garner more information to bring back home in order to feed to your government, and that will translate into militarization. The reason why that's bad is because although right now the situation isn't ideal, but at least more people being able to come in means that they can actively, tangibly build schools, build homes, give food and medicine to areas that are currently being blocked out, that victims don't have access to. And the reason why it's especially crucial that us neighboring states have access to this versus the European states is all of your reasonings, right? That it is more proximate. The fact that like you getting on a train or you getting on a plane means there's a lot of cargo and a lot of like baggage weight that you have to come in. It's really difficult for you to do that, that it's just much more limited if you're traveling far from Southeast Asia in comparison to if you're actually there. Closing.
How good is it charity drives when more likely on Gulf we can strong arm other states to take in these refugees?
That's not necessarily true, right? I think your strong arming doesn't necessarily end up helping anyone, because if the government that you are forcing to take in these refugees don't have the resources, given the fact that they're still struggling with trying to provide for people within their nation, given the fact that there is still some form of ISIS or splinter groups of ISIS actually now coming up more in Southeast Asia, and they're actually building up hubs and actually massacring some individuals in like certain regions in the Philippines, and then add that on with the idea of like needing to take in those refugees above and beyond what they actually can do, on top of that expecting them to also militarize and go against the government that is creating the Rohingya situation. That is a lot for you to expect out of individuals, that they are very likely to leave. Which brings me to my third reasoning. They will leave ASEAN. They said that, no, they won't leave ASEAN because, what did I say? Like the politics of one state hurts the other. That's why you need to interfere. I think that this effect at best is marginal, given the fact that in comparison to active engagement and active meddling in the situation means that you're more likely to bear the brunt of that political effect, right? Right now, they will choose to leave because all your economic benefits, they can get, like, at least it can be mitigated, right? At least it's mitigated through the fact that A, you have agency, B, the fact that you have China very willing to come in and like aid whatever economic need that you need, versus a world where you are forced to militarize, where you are forced to leave your people behind. That is a choice that oftentimes stubborn states, stubborn leaders that we all sometimes very well know in certain countries are not going to be willing to give up. For these reasons, proud to oppose.
Everyone okay? Then going to the toilet.
Please. Sorry, tea break.
Oh, that was okay.
You guys didn't consent, is it?
No, but on extension, right?
I guess they could, but like.
That's why I asked everyone, is everyone okay? No, if everyone's not okay, then like.
I mean, it's not okay.
And I know one good.
Yes.
You might as well go together and disrupt both the speeches, like one after the other. Might as well.
Where are you guys from? Singapore. And what is it?
So we're like, I was from US. We have like, at least like what, 9 years here. It's from most schools.
Can we not? I need to see his face, now I cannot speak.
There's some romance left.
Yeah, man. Interracial. Huh? You switch. Oh, I don't know. Oh, you're making a sexual joke. Okay. Please take a seat.
What happened?
Nothing.
Making fun of you, man.
Yeah.
Me?
Yeah, bro. They
What
make fun of
think
you.
you are?
Yeah. Please don't lie. So I've been coming out to Malaysia so many times, and I finally got the chance to debate with Mitrun. And sometimes I really wish that I woke up in the morning feeling like we are all part of the same country. I wish that we could all just integrate together. I could call all of you countrymen. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. But I will beckon you to imagine, Madam Chair, a world with greater ASEAN integration. What we bring to you from side closing government is a world where we actually achieve the goals outlined in opening government through creating the institutions and the supreme law similar to the EU that will achieve all of those goals. Enough for closing opposition to clearly engage with us and have fruitful debate. We're going to explain to you why ASEAN integration is the future. How will this happen, right? Firstly, there are great economic reasons for greater cooperation and common regulatory standards for standard of living and things like environmental standards and so on. Things that we normally legislate locally, but things that we can also expand across like different nations in ASEAN, right? It's akin to the EU post-Lisbon Treaty, right? So it's like, imagine that ASEAN right now is like the EU in 1971, right? Deciding based on like collective interest and the legal economy and as well as a need to create greater integration and imposing regulatory standards, like deciding to come together and create the European Union and evolution of the European economic community, right? Our policy is simple. A multi-stage progression, it doesn't have to happen overnight. You know, your leaders are not going to like suddenly like feel like their power is being threatened and so on. So it's going to happen in multi-decade stages, right? Perhaps 20 years to allow the formation of the discussion and formation of a common law like EU law to govern regulation and human rights regulations, right? So we impose this on all nation states, right? You have to follow the law, right? You have to follow these regulations that extend to most things and leave out like things like internal security, that leave out things like military and defense and so on, right? We already do this through law enforcement cooperation, through many multilateral organizations and supranational organizations, and through things to create law enforcement cooperation and things like anti-money laundering and financial regulations. There will be two pillars to this that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, common institutions such as the Agricultural Commission, for example, Agricultural Commission, for example, to regulate the price of agricultural exports and so on, and to create like optimum production for all countries based on cooperation between each other and sharing of knowledge. Things like human rights commissions to impose some sort of standard and create a talk shop for them to discuss what is a common human rights standard that everyone is able to follow and able to regulate. And secondly, the second pillar is that of supreme law, right? Where like law in terms of land ownership, corruption, health and safety standards, and so on, things that you have to follow, right? Why will this necessarily happen? We argue that currently ASEAN has the presence of many strong but slowing down economies. This will form your core, right? Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines, right? All of them like decently strong economies, but looking to evolve to the next level in terms of like providing jobs for the next generation of people and like moving forward from old industries, the old niches that are increasingly becoming irrelevant. Things like oil and gas for Singapore and things like agricultural exports for Malaysia and so on, right? There's a need to like create new entrepreneurship, new technological advancements and so on. Like Singapore needs to see a future where it is the center of a large economic bloc rather than like continuing to be this little high-tech island in the middle in a sea of less developed, like not so well developed, not so high-tech countries, right? You think that like if we don't do that, if we don't evolve and keep up with the times, we are unlikely to achieve the same amount of success in the future, which is why there is a incentive for many of these countries to continue like to integrate more and to cooperate more through things like Human Rights Commission, through an economic commission with commitment to things like lower tariffs, information sharing, and trade deals, right? We think that the process to achieving this common integration in 20 years means two things. Firstly, increase investor confidence both now and for the future, and increase in economic security as like the discussion of such integration plans is likely to be a shot in the arm for these countries, right? Countries are therefore likely to buy in, and even if they don't, we're happy to concede that we might not work, right? But the process of getting there, of discussing and creating these institutions, is likely to achieve some gains in terms of discussing future possibilities of what we're able to achieve with a common ASEAN identity and ASEAN institutions, right? And at the very least, this increases the discourse, stuff that Mary wanted to talk about when she talked about how, like in status quo, we already have citizen journalism, increased liberal ideals, people care about what's happening in each other's countries, and how this is actually good discourse that we're able to capitalize on at this particular stage in time with the power of the internet and so on, right? And create support for this sort of integration and cooperation in the future later, right? Look, what are the economic benefits that we want to bring to the table today that we are willing to risk the status quo to achieve? There are three things. Firstly, in terms of increase in trade, right? Intra-ASEAN trade as well as trade outside states like China. Intra-ASEAN trade is pretty obvious, like lower tariffs and so on, increase in like manpower movement and so on. All this is very good for countries that want to share knowledge and create more businesses and create more product and more exports, right? But what does it mean to engage with China? Like they alluded to it in terms of how like you don't want countries to like treat China as just like an alternative to ASEAN. What we bring to you is a future where ASEAN integrating together can engage with China as a bloc and achieve things like, imagine this, Madam Chair, imagine this, right? Things like high-speed rail trains crossing from Singapore to Malaysia to Thailand. All of these things, right, taking advantage of the economies of scale that you get when you operate as a collective economic bloc and engage with powerful regional economic superpowers. Right? It's only that's how then it's only possible for you to achieve this kind of immense possibilities, right? Like China is not always bad. Yes, I agree. We agree with opening opposition, but it's better on our side in terms of engagement rather than the status quo having China engage with each other locally. Yes, closing.
So here's my problem. If you're gonna say these countries are going to talk and come up with standards, Singapore oppresses its opposition. Malaysia literally locks them up. Other countries kill them. What are the kinds of standards they will come up with?
Human rights. Last thing, right? Oh, so two things about human rights. To deal with shit-ups, I have two things. Firstly, how do you deal with refugees? Secondly, how do you deal with government overreach? So like killing of extrajudicial killings, all that crap. How do we deal with refugees? We think a common migration framework is the only way for us to ever truly deal with refugees, right? A quota to accept refugees that fairly assesses countries' abilities and needs in order to take in refugees through a common, after deciding on a common process, deciding on common standards, right? Currently, status quo, this isn't possible because every country is just conditioned to deal with their own, consider their own selfish needs. That is not possible without a proper top shop. We think that we may not be able to solve problem now, but we can prevent future problems in next time, right? Same way that the European Union is able to solve migrant problems or able to take in refugees and allocate them according to quotas because they have the resources, the top shop to talk about these things, right? That's the second thing is about government overreach. There's no question there's a need to condemn these things like extrajudicial killings. But right now, like Duterte can just say Pulang Inamo, doesn't need to care about what you think. But in a world where we're able to have a top shop and impose standards on each other, that's when we open possibility for like condemnation and imposition of regulatory standards. And Mitra will tell you the rest. Bye.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
Look, I understand that governments have some fear in debate, right? But you cannot come up here and literally tell us that everything will be fairyland without telling us how exactly that's going to occur. My problem with CG in this debate is that they did not tell us at all how any of this high-speed internet is going to come from interfering. Why, like from open immigration, how would that even work? How would jobs even come? Why would countries even stay? Like so many questions in my mind. And I have these similar questions for OJ as well. There's three things that I'm going to talk about. First of all, how are these decisions likely to be made? This will directly clash with CG and why those standards will be extremely bad and make things even worse for human rights abuses. Here's where we learn from history. Secondly, I'm going to talk about even if there's a principle, why that interference is likely to be bad and lead to far worse outcomes. And third of all, I'll talk about how it forces countries to opt out and how that necessarily hurts their economies. I'll give you structural reasons why countries don't want to opt out this time. I won't just assert it like, Anyway, before that, just a bit of framing, right? I think in the top half debate, there was a bit of a clash about what ASEAN wants and what that principle is. Look, ASEAN is a collective of countries, right? That means that if ASEAN wants something, would have already done it. So like all of OG's assertions that ASEAN wants this, ASEAN wants to be a UN, ASEAN wants to interfere. If ASEAN wanted that, would have already done it. And the fact that it hasn't simply means that ASEAN in and of itself, sit down, doesn't want that. Because as a collective of countries, sit down, ASEAN is not a person. ASEAN represents the collective will of those countries. I think it's a lot truer what I was saying, that they're an economic bloc and that they want to maintain the economic bloc. And anything that hurts the economic bloc is a bad thing. All right, how are these decisions likely to be made? And this is where CG makes no sense, right? Because you have to understand that the strongest, like when they come up with this charter of human rights and all these things, sit down, the first thing you have to understand is that the strongest countries inside ASEAN have really, really terrible human rights. Malaysians literally have a prime minister who is like charged with embezzlement. Singapore doesn't even have a real democracy. I'm sorry, guys. But the point is that those human rights are unlikely to be are likely to be able to enforce in such a way that actually hurts human rights. Why is that? There's multiple reasons. So first of all, given the fact that these are countries who they of themselves have influence inside ASEAN. So you're talking about Myanmar. They will have influence in ASEAN as well. And what they will likely vote for is don't interfere with us, guys, because they have a huge stake. Duterte will now be able to do whatever he wants and sit down. Other countries are unlikely to see with him because Malaysia and Singapore, all these countries in and of themselves are unlikely or will want to see towards these economic benefits as well. So you're unlikely to get any benefits. Furthermore, what we tell you secondly is the problem with the UN itself, right? Stronger countries are likely to dominate inside decisions that are made inside ASEAN. That means that lower countries and sit down, countries that don't have much votes lose out. This is exactly what happens inside the UN. This is exactly what's going to happen inside ASEAN. Furthermore, sit down, we think that in your world, what happens is that China will be able to strong arm countries and to use these stronger countries to get more benefits under their side, under ASEAN, which means that you actually get the harm of China being able to control and monopolize things more under their scenario. But a third reason is that you just have zero checks and balances, right? Because understand, sit down, that ASEAN countries are necessarily extremely divergent in their needs and of their wants. You have very different economic blocks, you have different stages of democracy as well, you have different cultures as well, which means that there is zero checks and balances balance to sit down. At least in the UN, there's like China and like if there's Russia, there's like a US, which is kind of good. That doesn't exist inside ASEAN. So this is literally all the faults of UN on super steroids, right? And lastly, what I argue to you is that there's actually a disincentive from the US to actually come in to give aid, because at this point the responsibility comes towards ASEAN helping all this, because now we're interfering now, guys. So that means that US has actually less incentive to sit down to give aid towards these individuals. That's an extremely bad thing. All right, even if I assume the principle is true under opening government, why is that interference still likely to be an extremely bad thing? So there's just two things I'm going to talk about here. First of all, and I'll just go through this very quickly because I think it's quite intuitive. The first one is about military interference, right? I think this is something that they were very vague about, but assuming that it's true, this is something that even in a worst case requires massive amounts of money. Even in a case where you do have massive amounts of money and you are literally the most technologically advanced military in the world, sit down, i.e. the US, you can still cause massive amounts of harm towards these countries because you cause the violence to escalate. But secondly, post interference, you have zero ability to make sure that these countries are actually stable, meaning that you actually worsen the kind of killings that occur on the grounds. When it comes to sanctions, and they said like, look, it worked, this is the second thing, right? Oh, it worked to force Myanmar to open up. Yeah, at which point, like, Aung San Suu Kyi literally does nothing and remains silent, and that those slaughters continue to happen, and sit down after massive amounts of poor innocent Myanmars on the ground literally starve to death, means that even if you want to interfere, sit down. What I'm trying, the conclusion to this argument is that ASEAN and ASEAN countries, they don't have a military presence. They have zero way to interfere well. Even if you wanted to interfere, it would only cause more problems than actually helping individuals. Before I go on to my third argument, yes.
So like there really is no debate if the alternative in your world is that nothing actually is ever going to happen anyway because everybody's self-interest and nobody actually cares. Like we provided you the possibility, I think, institutions that facilitate these exchanges and provide possibility of having like imposing common standards. Can you please deal with any sort of alternative?
No. Okay, so I agree with you, right? Yes, countries can come together and ASEAN can interfere. The debate is about whether or not that interference would be a good thing or whether or not that interference would be a bad thing. I concede that interference can happen and countries can come together. I just think it would be bad. That's the debate, right? All right, third of all, how it massively forces countries to opt out. So I think there's three reasons why countries will want to opt out. I think the first one is when you look at what country leaders prioritize. I think OG had a bit of preemption here. They said like countries will want to stay because of economics. I think there's a few things here to point out. First of all, it's very likely that the leaders in power are shielded by their massive amounts of privilege, which means they don't necessarily care about that economic benefit to begin with. Secondly, what I think these countries are extremely nationalist, and that necessarily means that they would want to prioritize their own sovereignty versus this marginal economic benefit on the ground. But third of all, I think leaders can just place the blame on ASEAN trying to interfere. What does that necessarily mean? It means that if they choose to, and when countries choose to opt out, there's quite a few harms there. First of all, this massively harms ASEAN because ASEAN relies on the size of ASEAN to get enough export and import markets. That's bad for ASEAN as a whole as an actor. But secondly, what I argue to you is that inter-regional peace increases the more inter-economically tied countries are to begin with, right? So the reason why Myanmar doesn't want to attack Malaysia is because they're massively economically tied through ASEAN. This loses at the point where you have literally countries like Japan and Korea who are at each other's throats, who are now opting out of ASEAN and are part of an economic bloc. They have no reason to be peaceful with each other. We think what's far more likely to happen is you're far more likely to get inter-regional war and instability. For those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Here, here.
I think the funniest thing about the op bench is even in our worst case scenario, that is their best case scenario. That the status quo is one that's likely to remain, where Rohingya individuals will still be persecuted, that democracy will continue to fail, and we will never get a better prime minister. That is the status quo, and they do not change that. I mean, I think CEO does a little more to tell us why these things are systemic and will remain as problems. I'll engage with that in my extension, but let me deal with OO first. What did OO tell you in 4 key things? Number one, they told us that negotiating with China might be a good or bad thing. Oftentimes, individual states should be allowed to do that. I think what Alistair was telling you, and it is important to recognize this as a rebuttal, is that
China has the ability to strong arm individual states because of the immense amount of workforce that they have, the amount of economic power that they have. So that means that oftentimes, on a balance of probabilities, the favorable negotiating deals that you're going to get as an individual state is much less likely in comparison as a bloc. But why? Okay, calm down, bro. Okay, two key reasons, right? Number one, you oftentimes lose out trade to individual states who are unhappy with these things. So comparatively, if China was allowed to trade with ASEAN as a bloc, that means there's more amounts of capital and more amounts of individual states that are willing to take the capital. But secondly, oftentimes political dominance within these nations are lost out, right? I mean, this is a significant disadvantage to why China will not want to like only individually engage with country, but comparatively you can engage with it as a bloc. There's a lot more dominance you can exert, there's a lot more influence you can have. But this is not exclusive to China, right? This is exclusive to almost every other nation state that wants to negotiate with the ASEAN. I think that's important to recognize that Alistair brings to us. Secondly, they also said that they will call out bad behavior individually. This is where Sarah alludes that, oftentimes Malaysia calls out Indonesia. So I think the comparative is, if you're trying to go off the benefit, we do it far better because we do it as numerous states compared to your one state. And you never told us why that one state is sufficient. I get hazed every year and I don't think that's changing because Malaysia has been doing singularly. And I thought that's a problem. Sit down. Thirdly, the ruling elite will oftentimes hoard their wealth in the light of sanctions. We don't think this is necessarily untrue, right? We agree. I think that there needs to be a comparative to be engaged with. That means where the ruling elite has a lot more money, or like your average Myanmarese government has a lot more money, that means a lot more guns, right? A lot more police officers can be hired. A lot more people are getting paid to go into the villages of Rohingya to kill them, right? Comparatively, when they're getting sanctioned, the incentive to kill the Rohingya will always exist. But instead of when you have to make a trade-off, do you buy guns to go shoot the unfortunate Rohingya man, or do you buy bread to feed your people? I think oftentimes to stay in power, these individuals would rather make the latter of the choice, where they protect their own people, than to continue assaulting the minorities, right? If you accept this to be true, a lot of the OO's material is standing in the debate. But lastly, I think Mare tries to draw this analogy, right? She tells us that look at the EU now and it's failing. Let's do it on a comparative, right? The biggest problem in the EU is some Greek individuals cannot buy Greek yogurt. The biggest problem in ASEAN is people die because of lack of democracy, and people continue to be horribly and horribly discriminated as a minority, right? We think, right, that far preferable problems of the EU is much better than what ASEAN has in the status quo. Sit down, all right? What does CO bring to you? Number one, you can't guarantee success, right? Yeah, that is true. We're not going to guarantee you success. We're going to give you a framework which is continually improving as the world goes forward, right? But secondly, right, they said that ASEAN nations will opt out. So I think this is where we need to discuss the motion, right? This is that ASEAN should do this. That means there's an interest within these already leaders of ASEAN to make these choices. I don't think it's fair for you to say that they will immediately opt out. But we tell you that opting out also means, this is where Alice's speech is very important. Opting out means you will be facing some form of punitive measures, which means it's heavily disincentivized for you to do so. And if it's agreed upon across the op bench that our economy is oftentimes nascent and problematic, we don't think we can rely without the trade of our neighbors, right? So on that comparative, we think Theo loses out. Sit down. Why is CG the most important team in this debate? This is where there's a need for a roadmap to success, right? Or you need to understand that there's some level of imagination that you need. The biggest problem is status quo. Why we don't get FDI is oftentimes because there is no rule of law, right? Like an example that we draw here is the reason why oftentimes Zimbabwe lost out on huge amounts of FDI is because Robert Mugabe would just take up land that oftentimes belonged to MNCs or corporations and give it to the people to make them feel happy, right? But this sort of same economic problem exists across in ASEAN states. What does that mean? There's huge amounts of mismanagement of funds. There's no guarantee. Oftentimes, and this is true, right? Before money can come into Malaysia, a huge chunk of it has to go to the cronies of the Prime Minister and his followers. Those are all problems that persist when there is no rule of law, right? So on a comparative, you're more likely to get a rule of law when Singapore has an incentive to ensure every Malaysian gets equal access to their wealth, because the average Malaysian then increases in what it can provide to Singapore in return, right? That means that there'll be some incentive to establish these things. I think it's very convenient for the op bench to say none of this will happen and it'll never happen. I think you need to engage in a world where if it's likely to happen because of some level of incentive structures, there could be some benefits we can accrue, and you to choose the very easy line of attack where it wouldn't happen is not very strategic, because we're engaging with you even in your best case, right? Your best case is where some states leave. We think, yeah, okay, maybe Laos and Cambodia will leave and they will suffer and they'll probably want to come back in, right? That is not very, that is quite comparative. But secondly, what does rule of law oftentimes also lead to? But before 6, I will take opening.
Small, helpless Eastern European countries have EU skepticism because they are forced to have an intake of refugees, expected sanctions and intervention.
Correct.
Why is the same thing not going to happen here in a world where we have weak countries also wanting to leave ASEAN?
Correct. But then you also recognize that Turkey oftentimes had wanted to take in refugees and they didn't mind this because they oftentimes even they get a lot more money. So not only that they have more money to take up the refugees, the average common man gets a lot more money, right? So when the rule of law within certain states improve, right, and this incentivizes FDI to come in, a lot more money, and other states believe in you. This is important because what happens is there is an increase in the middle class, and this is very important because when the middle class starts to increase, that's when democracy starts to become better, right? The problem with the status quo now is there's huge amounts of political apathy because people don't have much to protect, right? The average Malaysian is given a bag of rice and said to vote for BN, and he continues to do that because he has nothing to lose in doing these actions, right? He needs to get a lot more money. He needs to start getting property. That is when oftentimes people are more involved in politics. That is why, like for an expansion of democracy, oftentimes the middle class needs to significantly increase. And that can only happen when there's an incentive for FDI or more FDI to come in. And the only way that more FDI can come in is where they are guaranteed assurance that these countries will follow the rule of law. Why is this roadmap to success very important? So we think that we actually improve democracy and recognize that this debate is not won and lost like in tomorrow, right? Like it may be possibly 30 years, possibly 40 years. If like there's more incentive for each individual state to keep a check and balance on their respective neighbors, that means that there is a marginal improvement towards respecting each other. There's also marginal improvement for FDI to see you as a block that is worthwhile of investment. You get richer and you probably want to involve yourself in politics because you know you're getting screwed over.
Yeah. Starting from taking the opposition at their best and pointing out the things they didn't engage with, three key parts of the debate. First, which way are discussions likely to follow? Mithun's speech was irrelevant because he just said, we claim discussions won't happen. Nuance. Discussion happens, consequences are bad. So it's like, I don't know what you did for 7 minutes of your life. Second argument in the debate is about, do norms matter? So Sharif's extension about proving that there are structural norms inherent to these countries and why you not responding to that is also going to lose you the debate because a lot of the consequences and the vector of those, like the way those consequences go depends on these norms, right? But the third argument is about also being the first team to prove that not only Rohingyas need money or not only that every country wants good economy, but that ASEAN as an economic bloc should exist, not just because it was their priority back then, but even in the modern day, economic prosperity structurally leads to other benefits. Oh, you didn't say that, Sam. Now, those are unique analysis that we provided, and these are all three really important things, right? But before that, a few things from opening that are a bit extraneous, not because, so first, right? First, opening just assumes a lot of things. Given enough time, benefits won't happen. It doesn't really happen if you don't analyze what the ideologies in these countries are. What are the dominant priorities? Are the domestic priorities important? Is there going to be a degree of concession as insofar as kind of like Malaysia and Singapore at least agree on stifling democracy and lowering standards? When you didn't do those discussions, you conceded that the consequences of the discussion is going to be bad. Given enough time, it's going to be worse in the long term. Also, Mithun's extension becomes much worse under that situation. Secondly, they said, oh, but these people understand best. We think it's very unnuanced. Simply saying that there's a cross-section of Malay people in 3 countries in ASEAN doesn't take away the fact that in terms of politics, ethnicity, history, religion, ideologies, these people are exceptionally different, right? So the fact is, given that all of those things exist, there really is no commonality that's wide. But secondly, if anything, that means that there's a lot of tension to the extent there is a common identity. If there's a lot of tension, it means that countries will become a lot more pushy towards each other and ASEAN will go in a worse direction. It means you give up economic benefits, but you also accrue political harms, right?
You also accrue politics. Now, moving into the engagements into the debate. First, in terms of discussion and which ways are these discussions going to go towards? The first thing was really clear, and we've been pushing this from the beginning in terms of why it matters, like how countries operate in their cases, right? So they didn't engage with all of Sharif's arguments regarding how people like Duterte are likely to get away. People in Singapore are likely to get away with things like gerrymandering, or people like Najib are likely to get away with things that they are doing. Even in the worst case scenario, you have to make a few conclusions. First, at the very least, these countries are going to be okay with things like using archaic laws to lock up opposition, right? Because these are things you can get away with. Secondly, they're going to be okay with being Singapore. So for example, like not jailing your opposition, but like gerrymandering them out of competition and like focusing on GDP. Look at how economy is great, right? So to the extent you want all of opening's benefits about like brilliant human rights standards and democratic standards, you can't have that if there is no internal incentive within these countries and the decision makers inside ASEAN making all of those things happen. That analysis was really important because it also ignores Sharif's explicit engagement, and this is where, like, let's credit the opening. Opening also talked about the fact that there are other stakeholders involved in the world. What does it really mean? The alternative is not some kind of primordial, pre-natural world where you divulge into chaos. The alternative is ASEAN creating its independent human rights standards and dispensing global human rights standards. That's really bad because we would rather have ASEAN be part of the global human rights regime, and that's something you can enforce, right? And to the extent you concede, things have changed in Myanmar. You have also conceded that in cases that are really important, you can meaningfully impose those things without ASEAN needing to be a form of political entity that starts interfering. But before I move into the other two stuff, opening.
Vietnam and Myanmar already have all the pressure that you think is so bad on human rights violations from the Western world. Do you not think that they can come to some kind of compromise where at least fellow ASEAN states be the ones interfering in these areas and have a much more similar cultural norm to them?
No, again, you're just assuming that people are all similar. You're also disregarding the fact that there's a lot more similarity. The fact that this proximity means there's more competition. You're also disregarding the fact that ASEAN will now have its incentive to come up with its alternative human rights charter. Like, that's literally what Mahathir Mohamad did when he tried to justify his years of tyranny. Years of tyranny by saying that we are ASEAN people and we're different, respect the elders. That's literally what like supporters of Najib does when they say respect my prime minister, used as a proxy for arguing that the prime minister is doing everything and everything is fine and dandy. Those are the kinds of things that happen. That's why the stakeholder analysis of the political actors was really important. Moving on, other important stuff. The second extension is also the second engagement, therefore, also is really important, right? This is where we concede that there was a world in which government could have won the debate. They could have shown that XYZ happens and either things won't get worse or these things are likely to happen. At the very least, there's going to be some kind of present political incentive. You can't just say things will get better in 20 years. In these 20 years, if things get like African Union, where you allow people like Robert Mugabe to become chair and decision makers of human rights standards, things don't become better in 20 years. Things get progressively worse in 20 years. That's where the key analysis was really important, and you missed out on that, right? But secondly, we also win this clash because we told you that political standards matter. Ideological divergences matter. Spectrum of powerful political actors that have their own selfish incentives and often either opposed to each other or like similar in terms of we all want dictatorship and want to oppose meaningful existence of opposition in our country matters, because those are the standards you come up with, right? But thirdly, we also told you that it's not like a bunch of very evil actors acting. Rather, it's this system in ASEAN historically that has meant that you don't just oppress the people. Rather, you consolidate support. You give them welfare. You consolidate pool of supporters and you get them behind you. It means that it's not just one individual demagogue at the top. There's also a huge political will behind a lot of these leaders, and a huge political will means that these leaders can get away. But the final argument was about impacting why economic benefits matter. It matters not just because of what Sharif said about how it leads to greater exposure, creation of a meaningful middle class, or empowers diversity of power. All of these things are really important because economy is a very human concept and it's within a spectrum. To the extent things will never get perfectly all right, you make things far better by increasing middle class and power diversity. But all of that is really important also because at the very least you're more likely to have things like greater open borders, visitors going towards each other, exposure and trust. That's how you slowly make things better. Sometimes it really matters because money is the only thing that can unite countries in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for the debate. First of all, we had I know, where are you